Hi everyone, it's good to see your faces again after, not your faces, but your names, unfortunately. After a little bit of a break we've had at Offset, we've been planning some new stuff that you'll get to know about soon enough. But I am very excited to start this month's chat with Russet, who is the co-founder of 10 by 10 Photobooks. And Russet's joining us from New York, where it's an insanely early hour that we've asked her to come online for. Thank you, Russet, and welcome to the Guftgu series.
Thank you. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm really looking forward to our chat today. Just to give all of you all a little idea about Russet and 10 by 10 books, I'm going to read out a small note for the same. Russet is actually a writer, editor, and a photo book collector, where it all started, if I may say, and lives in New York City. She teaches art writing at the School of Visual Arts in New York, and also writes for photo books and on photo books. She's written for Foam, The Eyes, IMA, Aperture, and also the ICP blog. And she's a co-founder of 10 by 10 Photobooks and co-edits the Gould Collection. I know I mentioned that she teaches at the School of Visual Arts, but she also takes lectures on photo books internationally as well, and is the recipient of the Prix Ars Electronica and the Smithsonian American Art Museum grants. We're going to move from Russet into 10 by 10. I see that a lot of people who've joined here maybe might know about 10 by 10 already, but for the others, I'm just going to give a little introduction. 10 by 10 Photobooks is a non-profit organization with the mission to foster engagement with the global photo book community. It was founded in 2012, and it offers an ongoing multi-platform series of public photo book events, including reading rooms, salons, publications, online communities, and partnerships with various art organizations and institutions all over the world. Welcome back, Russet. So I know there's so much to discuss with you, because I have been following up, with the various libraries, I'd say, that 10 by 10 has given birth to. And it was very interesting to obviously have a conversation with you previously. But as someone who's been collecting photo books, and, for the journey to have started there and to be where you're right now, of course, you've had immense exposure to how the photo book has changed and evolved. And it's become sometimes interdisciplinary even today. But I wanted to know from your perspective, like, how do you see the photo book? What is the photo book for you? I'll actually let you expand on that.
Well, photo book is a very loose term, and it's actually a term that probably came about in the early noughts, when we started to get many of these anthologies that started to document photography-based books by artists. I hesitate to give a very, narrow definition of what a photo book is. For me, it is any sort of book-like object. So that can be a pamphlet, that can be a traditional book, it can be a portfolio that uses photography as some element within the publication. So, for example, we have artists such as Carrie Mae Weems in the United States, who many people think of as an artist, not as a photographer necessarily. Right. But I consider her books to be photo books because they include photography within them. They're highly conceptual. They're a wonderful kind of merger of image and text together. Then there are other, one-off, unique artist books that are objects. For example, by Clarissa Slay, a photographer who, or an artist, I'd say she's a bookmaker, not really a photographer, who was active in the 80s. And it's a unique object that one would see in a museum, within a vitrine. So all of these for me, as well as something that might be a trade edition that you can pick up at your local general bookshop, constitute a photo book. It is a wide arena, and I hesitate to say it has to have certain criteria. The only one for me would be that there is some element of photography within it.
Right. I mean, since you mentioned some element of photography, it's you know, we've been having this conversation. I've been having it with some friends over here as well, where we also talk about how very often text plays such a big role in photography. Sometimes it can take away from the photograph in many ways, but very often a text can also be photographic in nature. You know, I mean, Sophie Calle, of course, is someone that we look at a lot, you know, within that discipline as well. And recently, at least, you know, within the region, there's certain books that have come out where, although the books might be text-based, they're still, in my opinion, considered photo books because of how evocative they can be to visuality. And I mean, it, like you mentioned that, I mean, you mentioned a couple of conceptual artists as well, and there's often this distinction within the photo book also of what is the photo book and what is the artist book. I just, I know we didn't really pre-plan this, but I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about it. Like, are they separate for you in any way, or?
Not at all. Besides running 10 by 10, early during my university years, I did an internship in an organization called Franklin Furnace, which, along with Printed Matter in New York, were the first organizations in the 70s to really support the artist book movement. Okay. And this is coming from people in the US like Ed Ruscha, who in Los Angeles, a Los Angeles-based artist, who saw that he had limited means in terms of the gallery system in LA at that point to get his work out. So the idea was to create a very accessible offset printed trade type edition and self-publish it. I mean, this is in the 1970s that we're talking about. And then just distribute it through, you know, local, at that point, bookshops were quite prolific in the United States. Now they're a little bit less so.
Different story now.
Books like his Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which many artists, photography as well as fine artists, kind of point to as one of the earliest, most important conceptual photo books, was not considered a photo book at its time. It was simply a means for an artist to make his work accessible to a larger public. And it sold for very little money, and now they're commanding thousands of dollars. So this is the market then stepping in and kind of making a distinction where the artist, him or herself, just simply wanted to share what they were working on, their ideas. Text was a very important part of Ruscha's work. And in fact, the word itself becomes a visual element. So the meaning has one level, but then also the way in which he kind of uses type, he places it within the ground, forms a very strong element of what the book is.
Right.
So that is always been there, I think, with photo books, the element of typography, text, what the conceptual meaning and the visual and how they merge together. You know, we continue to see that now all the time. And I just think it's embedded in the DNA of photo books. You cannot leave the photograph and the word, although some choose to just do one or the other,
right.
But they do have joining.
Right, right. And so, I mean, I'm curious because, of course, you do have an extensive knowledge about the history of photo book, and you know, you've been collecting photo books yourself. And I was very curious to know how the act of collecting the photo books, like what led you to be curious enough to start collecting the photographs in the book format, which although now it's, you know, more experimental and maybe even earlier it was to a certain degree, and how that then led to the creation and the founding of 10 by 10 photo books.
There's always been an interest in books, and my mother is a visual artist who was deeply involved in the book arts community in the 70s. So I grew up around artist book organizations and early feminist publications such as Heresies, which advocated the book. For me, collecting the book, quite honestly, began as a financial decision, because as someone who could not collect the photograph or the artwork, it was outside of my budget as someone who had just graduated from university, working in galleries and arts organizations. It was just the closest thing I could get was the book. And right. that was where the interest, I mean, came from. It's purely a financial one initially, but that then grew. And somewhere around, I'd say 1999, 2000, the early noughts, at that point I was married. I had a husband who was also interested in photography, was one of those kids who had the dark room in the bathroom growing up.
Right.
And we began to kind of scour books. There were early bookshops for photography in New York, like called A Photographer's Place. And then there were also dealers who were starting to support a lot of the artists' books along with the prints in their exhibitions. And there was one in particular named Andrew Roth, who had a tiny, tiny space. And he had recently been to Japan and brought back a whole bunch of books from Japan. This was around 2001 to 2004. And he began to have exhibitions of them. And stumbling into his gallery, seeing for the first time a Daido Moriyama book, it was unlike anything I had seen in Western photographers' books. My husband brought it home. We looked at it and we was like, whoa, this is out of focus. It's blurry. It's breaking all the rules that, you know, it's not a pristine photograph. And we just started to dive deeply into the Japanese photo books. And then at that same time, a few years later, these anthologies by Andrew Roth, probably being the second anthology after Ignacio Fernandez, who did a show at the Reina Sofia in Madrid called Fotografica Publica, which was probably the first exhibition of photo books, and he coined the term in Spanish, saying fotolibros. And then Andrew Roth did his anthology, 101 books, and then later you have Badger Parr, Jerry Badger and Martin Parr doing books. So this then started to create an audience. On top of it, in the early noughts, you have self-publishing really taking off. You have the means, you have the technology, you have the access to printers. And so the combination of these elements created an audience and created a market as well, and created an interest to further grow, particularly for us, the Japanese photo books.
And so Japanese photo books is actually where I think your knowledge base was also most expansive in, well, I mean, now of course it's across regions and contexts and different subjects and, you know, methods of representation as well. But I wanted to move from the collecting aspect into then the coming into form of 10 by 10. And it was very interesting to see how you spoke about, you know, your pop-up reading rooms and how they started, and also the kind of engagement and response you received on that. Maybe if we can go back to the first reading room pop-up and how you and Olga, who's also the co-founder of 10 by 10, kind of decided to just do it, actually, more than anything else.
It was actually 2012. And at that point, Facebook was just starting to kind of come into everyone's lives. And my colleague, Olga, had started a Facebook group. It was a private group for people interested in collecting photo books. And I was actually at Paris Photo visiting with a friend who writes on Japanese photo books, collects them as well, a man named Mark Fustel. And we're sitting on the steps in Paris Photo. He said, you know, there's this new Facebook group. This woman named Helka, which is Olga's online name, just started it. You should certainly join. So I joined, and there was great discussion. It was a small group at that point. It's grown exponentially since then. And Olga said, oh, to the group, and she's New York based as well. There's a Paul Graham opening at Pace Gallery. Anyone in the group, you know, come, just make yourself visible. We'll all meet one another there. And so we met. I met her at the Paul Graham show. We started talking, and she's like, you know, we should really share in person some of the books, and we should do a meetup. And so she arranged for a small Japanese cafe that is in Long Island City, not far from where she was living at that point, to host us. And the deal was that they give us the space for free, but we'd all agree to buy beers and alcohol from their
problem with photographers or photo enthusiasts around.
And it was a hot July day, so it was hot, no air conditioning. So we were all, of course, buying the beers very happily. And my husband, Jeff, and I brought an armload of Japanese photo books. And we just laid it out on the table in the cafe. And we just started to go through them and share them and talk. And the excitement, you could feel the electricity. We were all into this very nerdy kind of niche-like area of interest. And Olga and I, afterwards, you know, having beers after the presentation was done, said, you know, we have to do this in some formal way. And the New York Art Book Fair was coming up. I was writing for the ICP, the International Center of Photography library blog. And so I went to the people at ICP and I said, you know, New York Art Book Fair, you guys have a space just adjacent to it. Let's do a pop-up. Olga and I are talking about Japanese photo books. We'd like to share it with a larger community. Are you guys game for it? And they said, great, no problem. We took over the space. 9 weeks to go, reached out to all my friends in Japan, and I reached out to 10 of them. I said, each, please select 10 books and send them to New York. And within 9 weeks, we had a reading room. I mean, the fastest we've ever done one. And it was amazingly, you know, the goodwill of so many people who just donated the books to us. And sure. Meanwhile, Olga and I and Jeff went to IKEA. We, you know, bought the table legs. We went to the hardware store. We got the plywood and set up the reading room. And there it was, an opening night. And it was, you know, second night of the New York Art Book Fair we opened. The New Yorker magazine picked up on it. The librarians at the Frick Museum came. It was like this whole world came out that was there always, but we didn't know it was there. And so it lasted, and we were approached then by others to travel it. And hence the name 10 by 10 was born. We had no name at that point. But, okay, we have this structure of 10 people picking 10 books, hence a name. And then it started to travel to Japan, to Pittsburgh, to Latin America, to Buenos Aires. And this was all on the fly. And I call 10 by 10 still, to a certain degree, like an after-school club on steroids. You know, where we started very informally. We'd like to maintain the informal vibe because we feel if we become too corporate and too structured, we'll lose a lot of that ability to pivot very easily, to see what's happening within the community and to support it, because we'll have too much of an overlying structure that will impede us. So we are now a 501c3, which is a nonprofit official organization in New York, but we try very hard to keep it, you know, very bare bones. We function with the grace of so many volunteers and researchers. Olga and I both have other jobs. We now have a third person who's helping us as our director of salons, which is doing very much what you're doing, organizing all of the online, but we use Instagram. We're on break for August, but we were holding 2 per week up until this point. Right. And that's Dali Miran. So we are, you know, growing but still looking to our roots of this very kind of grassroots organization that needs to be flexible and nimble. So.
Right. I think that's what also allows you to maybe even experiment more, you know, like what we were discussing about, like when you don't have a lot of infrastructural baggage, if I may say, it suddenly allows you to experiment a lot with how to kind of engage, how to interact with people. And I mean, with 10 by 10 and a whole bunch of other library initiatives, ourselves included, you know, it suddenly allowed one to also reach and engage outside of photography, which I feel is so important within not just photography, but also the photo book. And it's allowed us to maybe in some ways kind of create methods of communication that traditional library institutions have not been able to do. And I was wondering if that's something that's it's a conscious decision to keep away from the institutional library structure, like, you know, like a place in New York, which is where you house everything, because a lot of your reading rooms also develop into libraries that are then shared with other institutions across the globe. And that allows a different nature of engagement even. So if you could just talk about what led to thinking about even that kind of a program, and how that's been working for you within 10 by 10. That would be really
Community is a very vast point for us, and maintaining access to the books is also quite important. So usually our reading rooms, and we've done 5 to this point, at the end of them, we find an appropriate institution that has interest in the subject and theme of the collective 100 books to then donate the books to that organization. And so, for example, because we already had an ongoing relationship with the International Center of Photography, they were first to host us, to take the risk, to allow us to come into their space. We donated the 100 books to them at the end of that touring reading room. We did another one, 10 by 10 American photo books, as we were approached by the Tokyo Institute of Photography, and we thought to bring the Japanese reading room to them, and we thought, quite crazy, a Belarus woman, which is Olga Yuskavich, my partner, and an American woman, to tell the Japanese what Japanese books they should look at, that's quite colonist. So we just not to go there, and instead we proposed to them, let's do an American reading room. We'll bring that to you. And so that reading room traveled through the US and through Latin America and Europe, and then ended up in Tokyo. And at the end, all the books were donated to the Tokyo Photographic Museum Library. For us, we do want to remain nimble. We are very clear that we want to maintain this sense of being flexible and not having the administrative overhead that impedes. But we do work with institutions and partner with those that have that very heavy infrastructure. And that brings us quite a lot, although we ourselves do not want to have that. I've learned very well how to work with organizations like the New York Public Library, which is a behemoth in New York. It's one of the biggest cultural institutions. And yet us coming in as this very kind of flexible, smaller arts organization can kind of harness their structure, harness their PR power, harness their resources, and partner in such a way that's beneficial to them as well as to us. So that is really how we function with these partnerships that allow us to kind of reach this larger audience. The people that walk into a reading room at the New York Public Library at the main branch of 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue are everyone from the book aficionado to the tourist. And it's lovely having that tourist who's coming in to see a landmark in New York, stumble into a reading room at the library and say, gee, what is this? And start to engage with the books. I mean, there are those who are tourists who come in who just want to see the lovely Rose reading room, which is one of the icons of architectural interior spaces in New York, and just walks out of the reading room. But the others kind of stumble in and say, oh, I had no idea these kinds of books existed. So it's that kind of touching that we try very hard to achieve. And so we're often very happy to be in spaces that are cultural institutions that are not just towards a certain audience, but that have a broader reach. For us, that's the ideal.
Right. And I mean, from there, it kind of, libraries, like you said, are this one central point that contain access to information, to histories, that range across subjects, across geographies. But I feel like what you guys have been working on are kind of like these libraries that are structured based on certain ideas of representation that have not been looked at, in previous collections, in the canonization of the photo book, even to a very large degree. And I mean, I'm quite interested to know what is the process of research for different, like how we see is actually where we got connected, in many ways. And for me, it was interesting to look at 100 books from across the region that actually dealt with books that are made and voice, women, photographers or artists across disciplines. And if you could just talk a little bit about how the research goes in. I know you have the 10 members of a jury who select 10 books, but how do you approach, how do you figure out how to balance that out? That would be nice.
Well, each project is quite different, but How We See, which was a project that launched in 2018, at the New York Public Library, then traveled to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Mass College of Arts, which is the arts college right next to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, because we wanted a public programming with the students involved to again expand the community. And fortunately, the director of photography at the Museum of Fine Arts said, let's partner with the art school right next door. And that way we could have photography students lecturing, giving these what we called spotlight talks, 15-minute talks on the photography books. So they each got to pick one and then share with their peers and the community. And for us, that's perfect. That is totally within our ethos. But the way that we develop the reading rooms is that we go to 10 people. We try to find a diverse selection. So in the case of How We See specifically, we looked globally. We looked for women who had knowledge of books maybe in Japan, in Taiwan and China, in Africa, in Latin America, in North America, in Southeast Asia, in India, Bangladesh. We really look towards as diverse an audience as possible. And what we do is we do give them certain kind of parameters that they have to use in order to make their selection. They cannot, because they are all involved in the photography book world, they cannot pick a book that they have a direct connection to. We try very hard to avoid conflict of interest. So they cannot have been the editor, the writer, the photographer. It can't be their best friend. They can't be promoting something that they will reap some rewards from seeing it gain further visibility. And that is a very important point for us, because we do want it is a subjective selection, but we do want it to have some kind of distance in terms of presenting the book. With How We See, it was quite organic, the way that a diverse group of books, 100 books from women all over the world, came about. And there was no need to kind of advocate diversity. It was inherently built within the project. Right now, because of the requests from How We See, and it was mostly contemporary books from 2000 to the present, we got a lot of requests for the history of women's involvement with photography books. And so we undertook that project for our next one to look at the history from 1843 until 1999, when How We See stopped. And that's the project we're researching now. And we're actually doing that one a little bit differently. Rather than going out to 10 experts, we had with How We See an appendix section where we had asked historians and scholars and writers to tell us historical books that they found interesting. However, that was like a 10-page section in the publication that accompanied the reading room, the How We See book. And it didn't have any expansion. It didn't have any dialogue specifically about the books. It just kind of laid them out and said, here are some interesting historical books by women that we all should take note of. So we use that as our basis, but we looked at that list, and quite honestly, that list was a lot of white women from North America and Europe. And we said, there's something wrong with this list. We need to do more research. So Olga and I delved into the research and started looking and reaching out to people within the photo book community to see, were there photographers in Iran in the 1860s or 70s who might have had an interest in photography and produced books? Were there photographers in Japan in the late 19th century as well? And it was interesting what we came up with. We came up with a fascinating selection of women. Granted, finances certainly played a role for women in the 19th century to be able to have access to photography. Julia Margaret Cameron, who's probably the best known of the period, was a very wealthy woman who came from an upper class background, who had access. In Iran, we found that there were women who were involved in photography, and they were clearly members of the Shah's court at that point, and had access. The Shah of Iran at that point had brought photography in the 1860s back to Iran. He shared it with members of his court, both men and women. And so there were ultimately women who ended up setting up studios, because only women could take photographs of women at that time in Iran. A man couldn't take a photograph of her. Right. So we did find very interesting projects, but this research is coming from Olga and myself reaching out to others, using the list of the original 10 historians and expanding on it. We are now up to 170 books. So we have gone quite a bit beyond the 100 we started with, because there is a vast amount of material of books that has never been documented. So.
Right. I'm going to maybe jump between how we see and come back to the historical book. In the specific case of Anna Atkins, whose book to be considered as a photo book was a big struggle for the world of those who defined a photo book for a very long time. And I mean, because I remember when you mentioned, we were talking about what constitutes as the photo book for you, and you know, you kind of said that it doesn't matter, it's any book that's been created by an author or a publisher for that matter, and whether it's 10 copies of it or 100 or 1,000, which would be a very tough number to deal with today. But you know, in the specific case, and I wanted to kind of focus on this just to elaborate on how tough it has been to in many ways rewrite the photo book history, not out of keeping consideration for gender, but out of pure facts of a book that existed before the first photo book, you know, history was written down. And if you could kind of elaborate on that to a certain degree, because I know even in the historical collection that you're kind of, the library that you're putting together, you came across many books where the name of the photographer was not necessarily put in, because you know, the photographer's name was not there. So you had to kind of also go into certain extra moments of inquiry and extra processes of inquiry to even cull out who was working at what point of time. Yeah, that's.
Well, if you don't mind, what I'll do now is I'll share the screen, because I have some visuals, and that can certainly help maybe those who are not familiar with Anna Atkins or some of the other people that we'll discuss. So let me just get the screen sharing up.
Yes.
And we can.
That sounds good.
Okay. And I am going to. Okay, I'm going to share that.
Yes.
And you have it now?
Yes,
okay.
I can see it.
Okay, so let me just go through. I mean, part of the reason that we decided to do this whole project was when we looked at many of these anthologies, what we noticed was only 10.5% of the book entries in those anthologies were photo books by women. So that was quite shocking. And then we saw 16.2% of bookseller inventories, and that's primarily online booksellers. So people like Steidl or PhotoEye or Mac.
Right.
And these figures are from 2018. So I need to be clear that in 2 years, we've made some progress. But when we started the project, of how we see, these were the numbers. But what was kind of enlightening was that in these first book and dummy awards and the shortlist, there was almost 40% of women, the books by them. So obviously there were women making books, trying to get them out there. And then of those first book and dummy awards, 28.5% of the winners were actually women. So it became quite obvious to us that there was a financial question here, that the financial question was that publishers were not putting their money behind women. But, you know, as you said, Anna Atkins was making photo books very early on. I mean, she didn't consider them photo books. It was 1843. She was a botanist. Her father was involved in the sciences. Again, she was a woman who came from a certain class who had access to photography. And so she made these cyanotypes from algae in the 1840s, and she shared them as volumes, kind of softcover volumes, with her peers. So as a result of it, quote, not being commercially available, it was deemed not to be a photo book by the photo book anthology scholars. They felt, in fact, Henry Fox Talbot was the first photo book maker because his was commercially available. And so they write the history with Fox Talbot being the first photo book maker. Yet in their anthology, and that's in Badger Parr Volume 1, the first entry is Anna Atkins. So there's a little bit of, you know, one thing is being said on their essay, and yet when one looks at the kind of visual chronological facts, it is Anna Atkins. who made the first book. We are very fortunate in that with our new historical project, since we are launching at the New York Public Library and they have an extensive collection of Anna Atkins books,
Oh, wow.
we can actually share with the public through vitrines some of this material. We also are planning to share the very rare books that people can't touch because our reading rooms are hands-on with the books on tables where people can leaf through them, through posters and large printouts on the wall so that people can have a sense of the interiors, not just the covers of the books. But let me show you, if you're okay, some other historically significant books. So this is how we see, before I go into that, you can see our reading room at the New York Public Library and some of the books that were included. They're from all over: Carrie Mae Weems, Zanel Maholi, Laura El Tatawi, Lieko Shiga, Pixie Lau, Dianita Singh. So you can see how diverse, Sophie Kahl, how diverse the crew was that we were able to get. And you can see how the books are out on the tables, people are browsing them. They're broken up by the selector. In this new project, they'll be broken up by chronology. And this is quickly the tour where it went to. This is what the publication looks like. Here are all 100 books that were included in the project. So you can just see their covers.
Right.
And these are the women that selected from the parts of the world. So you can see there was a woman based in Turkey, Ilgen Aksalu, who chose for the Middle East. There were women from Western Europe, from South Asia and Australasia. And we tried very hard to kind of touch really as many corners of the world as we could. This is from the publication. It was broken up by each selector and their region and what they selected. And they gave an essay for their selection. And then each book got a double-page spread entry. And so these are the historians that we started with for the current project. They selected the 100 historical books that were in the appendix in How We See. And this is what we kind of use as the basis. So you can see Jermaine Kroll, of course, figures very prominently from the 1920s and 30s in Paris. And these are some of the more obvious books that we know: Deanne Arbus, Helen Levitt, Claude Cahoon, Sophie Kahl, Nan Golden, Ushida, and Therese Bonny, who did Europe's Children, that little book with the girl over the man's shoulder there. And then, of course, you have Japanese as well as Latin America, Claudia Andujar, Amazonia, Francesca Woodman. You have Giselle Freund, who wrote one of the critical essays on photography as her thesis in France. Denise Abbott, Changing New York. So this is the launch of the historical book. It will launch with the reading room in 2021 in the fall. We are still on target for that time, but
I was just going to ask you. I was like, have you guys needed to push the deadline on that a little bit? But I know you guys have been busy.
Sure. Yes. You know, New York is still closed, and our public institutions are not open. We are so far still slated for 2021, but the New York Public Library may have to shift their programming that has been canceled now for 6 months during the pandemic. And if that is the case, then we will be shifted forward into early 2022. But so far, everyone is telling us we're still on. So
I'm keeping my fingers crossed for this one.
You get to be a little bit more closely Anna Atkins and the type of they're very soft volumes, almost on a kind of newsprint type paper, very fragile, obviously in that blue of cyanotypes of the time. And then there are other people that we've been discovering. In Britain, at the Victoria and Albert, we discovered a woman named Isabel Agnes Calper, who was the on-staff photographer who lived at the V&A in the 1870s. And she photographed all of the art objects for their exhibition catalogs. And she was never credited anywhere. So all of these photographs in publications that documented the exhibitions were by Isabel Agnes Calper, but the only way to know that she was involved is one of the researchers at the V&A has noted her initials on the glass plates. That's about it. Otherwise, she was written out of history. And so one of our goals is to bring back women like Isabel, Agnes, Calper, who were, quite honestly, very important in terms of documenting history, but never given credit. Obviously, her Julia Margaret Cameron, we all know about. Her illustrations to Alfred Tennyson's Idylls of the King and Other Stories is quite well known and in the collections of museums like the Getty in the US. This book, interestingly, was actually done in 2 volumes, and which is not very well known. But she broke up the photographs. They're allegorical photographs. The sitters are mostly her friends and the household help that worked for her, who she staged. And they're actually, I'd like to say, akin to photographs like Cindy Sherman, where they're staged and directed, and they're costumed, and very much that kind of narrating the photograph in the way that we know today. And this is, you know, obviously 1874. So this is quite a kind of material. Others in the US, a woman named Mary A. Bartlett, who also went by Mrs. N. Gray Bartlett, her husband's name, of course, did an illustrated version of the Mother Goose tales, which are the nursery rhymes that children read in the US and the UK. And in this case, we were talking about typography and images. Here is a beautiful example of how the typography and the image are completely integrated and made to act as one with these images. So please stop me if we're running out of time and you need to kind of...
I mean, I think we're good, because I think this would be really nice for everyone to see, because it's one thing when we talk about like historical books on photography, but to actually be able to see images and understand what they look like visually is definitely something that I think is great.
I'll go quickly. You stop me, please, and jump in.
Right. I'll just put in a small note to say if anyone has any questions, they can address it either in the Q&A section or on the chat. And once we've seen some of these really precious books, I mean, photographs of these really precious books, we can move into that as well. Thank you. Please continue.
Okay. So the next we have is Frances Benjamin Johnson, who was a Washington, D.C. based photojournalist. And she was actually asked to take photographs, or I should say more, she inserted herself in the role of taking photographs for the big exhibition Universal that was presented in 1900. And she was one of the first kind of women, or as she liked to say, lady in the business of photography and photojournalism. And one of the things she photographed as well was something called the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, which was one of the first kind of preparatory and trade schools in the US for African Americans. And what's interesting was she was a white woman, obviously of means, as were all the women involved in photography at the turn of the century. And Booker T. Washington, who was one of the forces behind this school, invited her to take the photographs to document it in the album. And what's interesting about this album was that it lay dormant for many, many years and was found by a man named Lincoln Kirstein, who was a funder of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he found it in an antiquarian bookshop in Washington, D.C. And he brought it to Modern Art, and they then did a show of it in the 60s. And it has gone on to go into various reprints and be a book that, you know, we now have access to because of its trade editions and accessibility. There was just a recent reprint by Sarah Meister, who's a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, last year. So it's quite lovely that it's accessible at this point. Another woman who's probably less known is a British woman whose name is Alice Seeley Harris, who went at the turn of the century to Belgian Congo with her husband as missionaries. And this was during the time of King Leopold, who was mining the rubber trade in Belgian Congo. And he had a whole bunch of kind of taskmasters who were really working the population there. It was indentured servitude. It was slavery in every sense. And their treatment was horrific. If they didn't work strongly enough, for example, the man in the center would receive the hands and feet of their wife and child to tell them, you better work harder because worse is going to happen. And Alice Seeley Harris documented these atrocities. And when she and her husband came back to the UK after their time in Belgian Congo as missionaries, her husband set up what were called magic lantern shows. And of course, it was under his name. You can see on the left on the announcement for the Magic Lantern Show that it's by J.H. Harris, but all the photographs were by Alice Seeley Harris. And this basically started human rights as we know it by their showing of this material. They also published pamphlets, and we will be including one of her pamphlets in the project called The Canberra and the Congo Rubber Trade, I believe is the title of it. Adelaide Hanscom, who did the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Again, we're talking 1905. This book is interesting to me because it probably has the first male nude done by a woman photographer and published. So that was quite risky.
Yeah, it's quite confrontational and provocative in, to reactions in many ways. Specifically looking at the time, I mean, I'd imagine even if it were to happen today, it would create a lot of tension and controversy. For it to actually happen in 1905 is actually, I think it just multiplies the idea of reactions to that.
Yeah, I think it was quite a daring move at that time. If we jump ahead to the late 20s in Europe, in the interwar period, Germaine Krull, who I mentioned earlier, she basically is an example of what we call the new woman in Europe, who was a time where there were relaxed attitudes about what women could wear, what professions they could go into, their actions and demeanor and behavior. And she did this incredible portfolio, their loose plates, of the building of the Eiffel Tower. And it's just an example of this kind of industrial growth in Europe, but it's done in this very kind of visually abstract way, which is, I think it's quite a beautiful and well known as well and expensive book at this point. Claude Cahoon, who is interesting because of her take on gender. She chose a gender neutral name. She worked with her partner as well, who was also her stepsister, named Suzanne Malherbe, and they kind of engaged in cross-dressing and gender performance identity. So many of these collages, which are surrealists in the book, are questioning the roles of gender identity and its fluidity, which I find quite interesting. Kathleen Colbin Thornbeck, who actually someone in China is working on a book on her right now. She was a German photojournalist married to a Dutch diplomat who was the ambassador in Beijing, which was called Peking at the time. And she partnered with a cartoonist to kind of do what I call like the ethnographic travel type of photo book, documenting the streets and the life of Peking, and basically a guide for the Westerner to ogle at these exotic cultures. And that was certainly one sort of photo book that was happening in the 30s, with travel being more accessible. And then of course, Bernice Abbott's Changing New York, which originally, that was, coming back to text and photography, she partnered with Elizabeth McCausland, who was her life partner as well, and was an art critic and photo critic who probably wrote the first critical essay on photo books in the 1940s. And McCausland wrote fairly political social commentary for Changing New York, but unfortunately, Dutton, the publisher of this book, felt it was too political and asked that they strip it down to just descriptions. So it changed the narrative of this book quite a bit. I'm not sure for the better, but it's what ultimately arrived.
Right.
Certainly Native American, a partnership between a male writer and an American photographer, Helen M. Post, As Long as the Grass Shall Grow, with text by Oliver Lafarge. And that was where she really went into the community and gained the trust of the Navajo and Apache Native American populations and documented them and their crafts and their lifestyle. And these were closed societies at the time. In New York, we had something called the Photo League, which was a very kind of socially responsible group of photographers who were documenting in the post-war period a lot of the poverty that was in the streets of the US. And Marion Palfy was one of the few women involved with this group. And she made it her kind of mission to document children and their situations of poverty across the United States, children of every ethnic background. And what's interesting about this period, the 1950s, we normally in the West talk about this as the kind of golden era of photo books. We have William Klein, who obviously did Life is Good and Good for You in New York, his famous book, and Robert Frank, Les Americans in 1958. We have very few women making photo books at this time. If we look to Western Europe and the US, this is the post-war time where women who had been in the trenches, metaphorically with men, who were working in the factories, helping make the arms, working as medics, are sent back to the home to become housewives, to rear the children. They are not out in the streets taking photos, and they are certainly not being funded to make photo books. And paper was quite scarce at this point in the West. So we find very few publishers willing to support women making photo books. Marion Palfy is one of the few exceptions in the 50s. We also have Emmy Andres in the Netherlands, who was part of the underground photography group. And she is also someone who was kind of in the wartime tragedy, kind of photographing the people who were living in poverty, who were not having, whose lives were deeply changed. She died, and this book was published a year after her death. She died of cancer at 39. Then you have women in their more traditional role, making books for children. And this Swedish photographer, Anna Rinkenbrick, did a whole series of photographic books for children documenting. It first started with Lapland, Ellie Carey, the book on the left, but then she went on to photograph children in Ethiopia. And these are books with images of children for children to allow them to learn about the world. You have others which are just more celebrity-like photography.
I love this book after you showed it.
The people that came into her studio, she went by the name of Viviane, and she is just a wonderful example of what we call in the US the National Enquirer, the kind of sensational news that we see. She photographed over 200 portraits in the 1950s. Now, for us to find these books in the 1950s was quite difficult. And as you're noticing, most are Western. We found very few books from non-Western countries during this period. There were one or two. And so, for example, you know, in the early 60s, we see Barbara Branley, Durazione Visualis, which documents contemporary dance companies. And interestingly, this book was documented in a recent anthology on Latin American photo books, and it's not documented under her name. It's documented in the section that reviews the design of Latin American photo books. And what is highlighted is the designer of the publication, a man named John Lang. So she's second fiddle. She's the photographer. It's her book. Her name appears on the cover. But in the anthology, it's documented under the man who's the designer. You have Japanese women who were working during this period in the 1950s. And Toyoko Tokiwa is a wonderful exception. She was a woman who photographed prostitutes, women in professional positions such as pearl divers. And this was something that was quite unusual for women to be in these professions, and then on top of that, for a Japanese woman photographer to document them. It's on very cheap paper, which is quite interesting, which I think is reflective of what was available in the post-war period, paper for photographers and for books at that time. So I'm going to stop just to give you a chance to say if we need to take a break.
Thank you. I know we have a few questions coming up, and before we move to reading those out, I also just wanted to know, because obviously I'm looking at the archive that you're on your presentation, and I'm trying to think about, like, women photographers from India, women photographers from the region, and I mean, you did mention in some ways that these are the collection that you have. There was very little that was found, at least around the 50s, that was created by women. I do know that in many ways the book form itself arrived, as a publication maybe much later, possibly than it did in, let's say, in Europe or in the States. But at the same time, we do have these very interesting women photographers whose works did exist during that timeline. And I remember we have, us having this conversation about, in some ways, when you create these libraries, you're also establishing a particular historical chronology of the women who did exist in a particular timeline. And so how do you deal with when you see, maybe they're unpublished books, maybe they're maquettes, maybe it's just someone's personal diary, but it could actually be, for all purposes, a photo book as well, or photographers who've existed, who've created something that might not fall into the photo book format, but their work is still important. When you create an anthology, of the nature that you are doing right now, how do you then find spaces to also make sure that these women do not get forgotten in many ways?
That's an incredibly important question, and one we've been grappling with a lot of time to pay attention to this, because we feel we cannot find for these earlier periods. I mean, in the 40s, I found a book by S.E. Robeson, who was married to the famous African-American comedian and actor and singer Paul Robeson. And she was a Columbia University educated chemist who also took up photography as part of her professional career. And she and her son in, I believe, 1943 or 45, right after the war, traveled to South Africa. And she did a book, which is both text and photography. Defining the photo book very broadly is a very important aspect. You asked that question early on. In order to incorporate as many broad examples as we can, we are incorporating pamphlets, we are incorporating dummies, we are incorporating unique albums. If I'm speaking about South Asia, I'm going to jump ahead. There's a book that was done by Dayanita Singh in the 1980s, which has recently just been released. I'm going to...
Yes. I might have the book here, in fact. Okay. Give me a moment. I'll just bring the book.
Okay. And I'll talk while you're going to get the book. Dayanita Singh did this book on she traveled over 6 winters in the 1980s with the musician Zakir Hussain. And she photographed him and his colleagues for a graduation project that she began. And it was actually her first book. And what's interesting about this book is she published this book in 1986, but this year, actually, I believe this month, Steigl has just released the maquette that she did for this book, along with supplemental material. So the good news, I say now, is that these mainstream publishers who have a fairly wide distribution within the photo book world are accessing this material. These earlier books that maybe a few people had access to. I'm not sure of the edition size of this. Do you know the edition size of this book? Yeah, this is the maquette.
Yes.
That was just re-released by
Steigl. We just got a fresh delivery from Amazon.
So you can get it on Amazon, the maquette with all of her kind of pastings, as I understand, and her kind of working models are within this book. And this is based on this earlier 1986 book. So, I mean, this kind of brings together word and image, as you can see. It's both got the kind of handwritten text as well as typeset text. And it's a good example of word and image. It also has all of, in the maquette, all
other elements in it, which have her text as well, and her sketches. I don't know if it's not the best way to show this, but we're going to try to. And this is a big poster, I think, which it'll be too large for me to open it right now. Yes. But yeah, and then there is the book that she made.
Now, this is just for me a great example of the rewriting of history that we were talking about earlier. That, you know, it's not just 10 by 10, but it's the whole photo book community that is reassessing itself. And it's looking to these books that maybe had a very limited run or were a one-off single album or a maquette, and they are starting to publish some of them. The one area, though, that we really struggled with in this research was particularly in the 1970s, which was a golden era for women in photo book and artist book publishing in Europe and the United States. We struggled to find books by African American women published during this time. Those books that we found were women who had direct access to the publishing world. For example, a book by a woman named Louise Jefferson, which documents the handicrafts of Africa. And she was working in publishing. She was an art director. She was a graphic designer. So she had direct access to those in charge of financing books in the publishing industry. And she was able to go to people, such as Viking or Doubleday in the US, the big publishers, and say, I have a book idea. Why don't you fund it? Why don't you do it? That's the rare exception. Another book that we struggled with, and we are not putting in as a main entry, is a book by Toni Morrison, the African-American writer. And she was an editor at Random House Publishing in the 1970s. And she did a book which has recently been re-released in a new printing called I'm sorry, the phone is ringing now. You're going to hear the phone in the background here. It is called The Black Book. And what we decided was ultimately it was not a photo book. It was written by several men. Morrison did the collage of images that are vernacular images. But what we're going to do is put it in what we call our timeline. I'm going to turn off the machine. Excuse me a minute.
Okay, no worries. Thank you for staying on for this long, guys. We're now going to move to the questions as soon as Russet is back, because I know there are a few here, and hopefully you won't have to send your too long. Great. I just realized we do have a few questions. Maybe we can start taking them.
Kind of put us off sharing.
Yes.
I will stop the sharing. Stop sharing. Okay, so I am back.
Wonderful. Welcome back. So now, I mean, we've actually got a few questions in the chat section, so I'm going to read them out of there first.
Right. Sorry, someone is persistently trying to get me. So.
Sorry, guys. Making sense of our current day world. Yes. I hope you've found this interesting. I mean, one of the reasons for why we were interested in doing this is to also see how libraries function, and also how in the region there are very few libraries, but maybe this can help expand the conversation to the region as well and look at what we can do here. I'm going to start with Tejal Pandey, Russet, who's a photographer from Mumbai, actually, as it is now called. And she wanted to actually know about the essay on photography that Giselle wrote. I think you spoke about.
Giselle Freund, yes.
So she's asking if you have the name of the essay for Giselle Freund's.
It's called The Photography and Society.
Photography and Society, okay.
And it's published in both French and English. I'm sorry, I have to put that phone back on. It's doing all this kind of crazy things.
I think it is now a reasonable hour in New York for people to start calling. So we're gonna just wait for Russet to come back and then get on to Garrett's question, actually.
Now completely unplugged. Okay. Yes. It is called Society and Photography. It's first published in French. It was her dissertation, and then it was published in English as well. So she can find a translation easily on Amazon. It's a little slim kind of paperback, and in the same way as Susan Sontag published on photography, which is another wonderful kind of essay on photography by a woman.
Are these incorporated into the historical book?
Yes, we have a section in the reading room publication in which we will have books such as Lucia Maholi's 100 Years of Photography, which is an early publication. Although she was a German speaker, came from the Bauhaus, it was published by Penguin in English initially, and only later on by the Bauhaus Archives published in German. So it's interesting where things get financed. And again, this is part of the larger question of this history.
Right. So we're actually going to move to more contemporary ideas of the photo book with Garrett's question, who wanted to know, Russet, where in your opinion do you see the future of photo books heading? And what is your opinion on photo books as sculpture or installation?
Well, there are plenty of photo books, sculpture, and installation. I mean, that is, book, when everyone was kind of predicting its demise, artists came in to just kind of sculpt the library. And I remember going to the Frieze art fair here in New York, and I just wanted to take count of how many sculptures, photographs, paintings included an image of a book in it. It seemed to then be an almost nostalgic aspect. And that was a few years ago. I don't think the books are going anywhere. And I think that if anything, we have or had, I think it might change with the pandemic, a glut of publishing and of niche photo book publishing. And with that, you have incredible books that come out self-published, but you also have some fairly awful books. And having the fairly awful books and the failures, or the ones that we don't like, might prove in the future that they turn out to be these amazing books that we all couldn't look at the time and didn't have the eyes and the mindset to see the brilliance of the photographer and artist, or they are just that, total failures that we learn from and say, okay, this is what doesn't work. Why did it not work? And in order to have a thriving community, I feel quite strongly that we need to have the full spectrum. We need to have publishing of wonderful books and publishing of bad books. So I don't think to answer his question, I don't think the photo book world is going anywhere, disappearing.
That's definitely encouraging, because I think we've all been anticipating the photo book to take a different kind of a formation almost, it seems, because I mean, I know there are a lot of books, photo books that are coming out, but I don't know how many of the authors or publishers are able to kind of successfully sustain on it. And I think that is a growing concern for many even. So it's quite nice to hear you say it's not going anywhere, don't worry.
Not going anywhere. However, to your point, I think the percentage, it's like a pyramid. The percentage of people who actually financially have a photo book that they make money on is not very large. And it's until you go to a more mainstream distribution through distributors like DAP in the US or Idea Books in Europe, you have a very small distribution done through fairs, through online. That circulates within an insular community. And if we are to get the book out, we need to move beyond and have that wider distribution. That said, will that wider distribution appeal to a broader audience? And unknown. In some cases, yes. Some cases, no. But the book as object is certainly something that has a long history. It's had a long history in the US as well as in France that I know of specifically, with places like Printed Matter or Franklin Furnace, as well as in a woman named Caroline Cour in Paris, who's always had these kind of pop-up artist book exhibitions and galleries. But her funding is not very good, so she kind of dies out for a while, and then she resurfaces and pops up again. And they're clearly sculpture as a unique object in her exhibition.
I'm going to move to Virangana's question. Virangana is a curator actually from India, and she wanted to know, a lot of women writers used pen names, George Eliot for instance, to be read more seriously for their work. Have you come across any old photo books by women who have used alternate names for their work to get published, or even just get recognized for their work?
That's an interesting question. I think Claude Cahoon is probably a case. She used a gender neutral name. She presented herself as gender neutral as well. So certainly she is an example. I think Alice Seeley Harris, who I mentioned, used her husband to present her work. You know, again, then there were women who didn't ask for the recognition. They knew they wouldn't get it. And so they did their work more in obscurity. And those are examples like Isabel Calper. There's another woman in Germany who was a photographer who photographed and documented others' work and published the books in Berlin. And her name was Laura Bette, B-E-T-T-E. There's very little written about her. And, but she had a publishing business, which was quite rare in the 1860s for a woman. The business was taken over by her son, Paul, after her death in 1870. But I think that most women, I mean, I've been corresponding with a curator who runs a traditional African American museum in Georgia. And she said that there are tons of maquettes that she knows of floating around, in particular by Black women from the 1970s, because they didn't have a hope in hell to get their book published. And so these ideas sit around. The few, I mean, that did, yes, had to, you know, in the particular case of white women in the 1800s, kind of stand in the shadow of their husband, such as Mrs. N. Gray Bartlett. Her real name was Bartlett. So this was quite common, yes. We're finding them, they're there, gender neutral names, or just maquettes.
Hopefully you'll be able to, and they do exist more from this region as well, so we can incorporate. But you did mention that even though you do create like how we see is done, or even, I mean, specifically in the case of the historical photo books, that even once your current final list is released, that it's always up to editions. You're always open to more editions as and when, you know, they are realized.
This is purely a starting point. We see every reading room as a starting point and invitation for others to expand upon it. So, for example, in the book, we are going to have, as well as a section on books written by women on photography, we'll have a section that we call the timeline, which are many of these unanswered questions. For example, you know, the book of the Black Book by Toni Morrison. We deemed it not a photo book, but we did deem that it was significant to the history that we're discussing of women in publishing. Another example is a Japanese woman who set up a studio in the 1860s with her husband. We found albums, but the albums are attributed to her husband. I spoke to so many Japanese scholars, no one can pinpoint and attribute her hand within these volumes. Yet we suspect that, but we can't put that in writing. Right. So my hope is that someone down the road, a Japanese scholar, does further research and actually documents that she was involved in these albums and that her name should be attached to them. So it is a jumping off. And we invite many, many questions to that. We found examples of studios started by women, but no books that came out of them. There might be books. Someone has to go out there with a PhD dissertation and unearth that. And we open the invitation for that.
That's good to know. We have actually, I think, 4 more questions. So I'm gonna, do you have time to, I hope you do have.
It's very early in New York, and I'm not a morning person, I have to be quite honest. So.
Thank you.
It was 8:30 when we started, 8:30 in the morning, and so now it's getting more my time, 9:45. So we're
okay. Okay. So Madhu actually wanted to know, his question is, publishing a book is very expensive. How can a photo book be published from an independent photographer without much financial burden? Historically, does this limited published photo books, historically does this limit to publish photo books because of financial constraints, particularly from photographers?
That's an important question as well. And obviously you can produce a digitally produced photo. Depending on the type of imagery, digital printing might be appropriate. And there are plenty of services out there that one can use. I mean, the main one in the US is Blurb. The quality varies greatly. And that's an on-demand kind of publishing. So it's, they gang the jobs together. So you're not sure what color you're going to get because you can't check it. And as a photographer, as we all know, that's quite important. But sometimes I've seen Blurb books that are just beautiful. They're done fabulously. You can print only 5 of them, so it doesn't cost you so much. the main issue, once you produce this book and you spent all the time and the kind of love and your soul is poured into this, is how to distribute it. And this is where, if you don't have a distributor, you then have to take the expense of going to fairs and set up your stand and sell your book in that venue. It is very time consuming. You get very good at, I mean, we in the US self-distribute because the distributor, the big distributor in the United States, DAP, has quite onerous terms. They take 75% of the retail price. We can't afford that as a nonprofit.
That's absolutely impossible.
Yeah, it's absolutely impossible. And then that's for them to buy outright from us. So for some artists, they feel that with a first book distribution is quite important. So they're willing to take on those onerous terms and have a distributor sell their book and then only receive 25%. So it actually functions as a loss for them in most cases.
Right.
But one way is that. I mean, oftentimes there's something very wonderful about being out there at the fairs and having the dialogue with people and learning, you know, how they respond to your book, you being the advocate talking about it. That to me is much more engaging, to learn from the photographer why they made a book. And that's what I like very much about going to places like Off Print or Polycopies, or I'm sure in Chennai there's a book section, right?
There's a photo festival in Chennai. We have there's a photo book fair actually, which takes place in Jaipur. It's called Art Book Depot. And we guys had done the programming for their last festival, which was luckily enough in January this year. So we escaped very closely. But it is true that there are very few channels of distribution. For the book form, there's almost nothing. I think there's Art Book Depot that I can think of, which actually focuses on artist books. It's not specific to photo books alone. It looks at graphic books, books by illustrators, books by paper makers. So it's actually a really nice way to also understand your fraternity and understand the different mediums that are being experimented with. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's more coming up.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting time, and I think either we'll see people being kind of a bit isolated and working on book projects as a result, and we'll see a flurry of books that come out after the restraints are lifted. But I do think there are two parts to publishing a book. One is that aesthetic, creative process, and the other is the distribution. And I don't want to discourage people, but one needs to think about that as well in entering into this process. Do you have some sort of network? Are there festivals that you can participate in order to share the book? And then you have to think, how many are you going to print? Are you going to print on demand? The quality might not be as good as you like as a result. Or are you going to print with an offset printer of a certain caliber and quality? Obviously, with printing more books, the price per book goes down. I find that the threshold is somewhere about 1,000 books, that the price starts to become reasonable per book. But you're talking thousands of dollars. An average budget for a photo book, you know, once you get done paying a graphic designer and preparing the scans and the pre-press and the printing itself, runs, I would say, in the ballpark between, all costs considered, $18,000 to $25,000 US dollars. That's quite a lot of money.
That's a lot of money, yeah.
Yeah, and that's US and Western Europe prices, obviously. But many photographers don't have that money. And those that do either get a grant or get underwritten by a gallery or another arts organization in order to publish that book, they see it as their first book as their most expensive business calling card. Oftentimes it is to hand out to people. It is to share for people to know what they're working on.
Does that then become a catalog? I know we're extending this. Sorry, guys, we'll get to the questions maybe very soon. But, you know, then doesn't that go more into, I mean, is a catalog different from a photo book? It's another different question. So
a photo book has an ethos, a kind of aesthetic sensibility. A catalog is purely documenting, often an exhibition.
Right.
Sometimes a catalog can function like a photo book as well, but I think that has to happen in the intent and how it's originally conceived and designed.
Right. I'm going to move to our next question, which is from Adil Hassan. Adil saying, hi Russet, I was wondering if there are specific regions apart from European Union and USA, and maybe even Japan, that you see a new or fresh movement in photo books, perhaps away. Sorry?
Latin America, for sure.
Latin America, okay. So yeah, well, I think that we're going to keep it.
And there's a thriving distribution network within Latin America of fairs and activities, but we don't see it in the US north of the Mexican-US border.
Right. So. Well, Inframundo is a place, I don't know if you know about Hydra and Inframundo, who are basically, and they're doing amazing work. You know, I absolutely love their books there. So.
Yes. There are artist bookshops and photo bookshops in Mexico City. I was there in February, actually, for Zonamaca. And it's a thriving community. It's a great, great photography and photo book community. And there are great designers, there are collectors.
Yes.
We just don't see it in Europe.
Quite surprised to see that.
Asia, I mean, it doesn't travel. As I've heard, there's a thriving community of photo books in South Asia and India. And the problem is distribution. This is the key piece for this material.
Right.
Hence our libraries. We try to kind of cull and so, for example, the selection from South Asia and Australia were books that Iona Ferguson had to send to us and had to collect. And because it was so difficult, we couldn't buy them.
Right. Well, it's a small little confession, but like, I think there might be a possibility for you to get access to more books from the region very soon in as easy a way as just ordering it online.
Perfect. And that is what's needed. Right now, unfortunately, shipping is quite complex in the world. Yes. And so I assume this is going.
That's the only tricky bit, I think, that's kind of holding things back. I'm going to move to Indu Anthony's question. Indu is she's an artist who also works with photography a lot. And she actually, if I may say this about Indu, I don't know, but I think she started from photography and has now also incorporated many other disciplines into her practice. Indu just wanted to know, what do you think of a photo book as a single book, which then becomes an object that is made like a single art piece, sold similar to the price of any other artwork?
I think that's fine. I come from that background, certainly in the 70s, watching book artists, of which my mom was a member of the community. And there are places in New York like the Center for Book Arts, that's what they do. They do old press books as well as unique objects, which are art objects, which are oftentimes sold in galleries, which take on the commodification structure of the gallery and are sold for quite a lot of money as a unique object to be exhibited like sculpture. So yeah, books function on multiple levels, and I see the plurality of whether it's a zine, which you buy for $5, or it's a sculpture-like object that goes for thousands of dollars, all viable. Obviously, different parts of the audience will have access depending on how expensive the object is.
I have two more questions, sorry. Zahra Amruddin, who's also a photographer and also teaches photography in Mumbai, wanted to say, Russet, I recently came across the work of one of India's earliest women photographers from the 1930s, Manobina Roy. She's around the same timeline as the photographer we were discussing.
Any books? This is the big question.
I had the opportunity to go through her private collection shown by her son. She often lived in the shadows of a famous filmmaker husband, Bimal Roy, and her collection is only now known. As photographers and writers who might be the only consumers of these important fragments of history, how do we make this information a part of our historical narrative outside of the community? I think that's a really important.
I think that comes to the kind of seeds of what we're trying to do with this particular project. I mean, one of the ways is that there has to be an advocate, and either a member of her family or a historian or scholar who is unearthing this material and bringing it to the public. I personally would like to know if there are any book-like maquettes or dummies within the materials that she unearthed. And if yes, you're welcome to share with her my email, or I can just info at 10x10photobooks.org.
I'll just actually add it in here so that maybe everyone who's attending has a question.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest issues. How do we make this material accessible? And, you know, certainly by writing about it on blogs or photography magazine sites that are accessible to a larger audience is one way to get it out there. Organizing exhibitions is another way to get it out there. Many of these archives that I'm finding are in university libraries. And yes, they're preserved, but you have to find them. So just donating them to a library or public institution is not enough to make people aware of them. And so it needs to be done through articles, through blog posts, through exhibitions, through sharing with publications. And I would be very interested. I mean, my big kind of research at this moment is to fill in any gaps we may have. A prime directive for us in order for a book to have an entry is that we can physically document an object. And so we have to be able to photograph a book. So we know about many things, but no one can turn up the book. So hence, these objects that are suggested go into that timeline discussion section for those future scholars to track down the family members as this questioner has encountered. And so, yes, it is quite important. I think the only way to advocate is to start writing and documenting it beyond just a closed archive of a library who will preserve it, but may not promote it.
Right. Thank you so much. The last question was actually with Abhinav, who I think has been answered in some ways with Zara's, question as well, because he wanted to know about how we can get photo books outside of the photography community as well. So is there anything that you might want to add?
That's a hard one because the photo book community is quite insular. It's global, but it's an insular global community.
Right.
And for a book to jump over to the mainstream, to be in a Barnes & Noble or a kind of mainstream high street bookshop, they're not going to take it. They have to sell. Their real estate costs and rent are quite high, and I rarely see those kinds of books. Maybe, I'll see an Aperture book among mainstream photo book dealers. I mean, we have a few in New York. We have specifically a photography bookshop called Dashwood. We have McNally Jackson, which is a mainstream bookshop, but it's small enough and independent enough that they have a wonderful art and photography book buyer there. We have the Strand, which is one of the famous, well-known bookshops in New York, and they have quite a good photography buyer as well. Those are the exceptions. You go into other small books and shops, and maybe you'll see an Aperture book, but not much else. So to get it out to that larger audience, I think we need a little bit of guerrilla tactics, and I'm not sure what those guerrilla tactics are because the finances don't make sense to those bookshops. And certainly I think it means artists kind of taking the initiative. And for example, we have in the US these little libraries in neighborhoods, which are literally boxes on poles where neighbors put a book in the box and another neighbor can take it out to share. And I love, you see these in rural areas, and you see these in not so much urban areas. And I love the idea of these kind of neighborhood library boxes. And maybe this is one way to get out photo books. I mean, I'm throwing out crazy ideas. That you set up a library box.
But that's what you need. You need crazy ideas.
Put in a book, and you get to take out a book. And so it's community sharing. It's not going to be financially rewarding, but it is going to open up that idea of access.
Right. Well, I mean, over here, I do have to say that photographers have definitely been very inventive because, I mean, I can't say much for Europe or the States, but at least in India, distribution channels are very, very limited. So actually the biggest distributor in some ways is Facebook and Instagram, because that's the only way to kind of communicate. But they have been very interesting methodologies that some photographers have taken up. I mean, we had a photographer, Ritesh Uttam Chandani, who made a book on Bombay, and he would actually personally go and hand deliver every single copy for people, you know, in the city who would ordered for it. And so they are interesting things that are being tried out, and hopefully slowly over time with more fairs that deal with the book, you know, coming in, that maybe there's an awareness of the photo book, and also the fact that photo books are not meant only for photographers. You know, it's something that I've truly believed in. Even when we started Offset, for me, one of the drives was like, what if it was only writers who read literature, and it would be such a loss for the, you know, for everyone, because it suddenly opens up your emotional ability to empathize, to sympathize with other scenarios. And hopefully photo books are also going to be able to get there soon enough.
I hope so. I mean, I think that, you know, it still remains a niche community, but I think initiatives such as yours, and certainly if it becomes easier to acquire via an online site, I mean, we see that in Japan with Sha, which is a bookseller in Japan, that makes it very easy. The shipping is quite expensive. And so you have a $50 book, but you're also then paying maybe $45 to ship it. So these are constraints that we work in. And the average buyer might not be willing to spend that $40 or $45 to ship the book. So hence the fair. Hence
yes, the very important fair.
The corner neighborhood library boxes. I mean, in my building, we have a table in the mailroom where neighbors, I don't know if this happens in India as well, where neighbors leave books that they've read and they no longer want, and they're passing along to another neighbor, and you can go through that table. It functions the same way as these little boxes on street corners in rural America, and you can take a book and put a book, and it's kind of a swap. And I think that through these networks, maybe then we will like touch someone who maybe doesn't know about photo books. You put a photo book on the table, and so they've left their Danielle Steele, you know, chicklet novel and taken a photo book in exchange. I mean, it's these kind of small gestures that will, you know, start the kind of exchange and dialogue, I hope.
Right. So everyone who's probably here right now, maybe we can start a little table in our community. Well, maybe not right now, because everyone would be too freaked out to pick up or drop in a book. But that's something to think about, you know, alternative ways of getting books out there and getting non-photographers to look at photo books. One of the things actually that we do at Offset is we try and go into schools and universities that are not photography based, but use one of their library classes as like a session that can be where we bring in photo books. So suddenly students of sociology or students in 9th grade are suddenly engaging with a different kind of reading. And maybe if you have a school close by or someone in your university, you can try that out too, you know. We never know where this leads.
Yes, partnering with academic institutions along with the museums is key. We also make the students the experts. So we assign them or let them pick, quite honestly, a book, and then they do a 15-minute talk to their peers on it. So we step back from being the role of expert. We embolden them with that role. And I think that's part of expanding the community because people often feel that they don't know something about it, and so they're a little shy to kind of embrace it. but if you make them the expert, all the better.
No. Yes. Well, on that note, I'm gonna maybe wrap up today's chat. Thank you so much for staying with us for the extended half an hour even. You know, you're probably gonna have a long day ahead now, and we started it off even earlier, but it was a wonderful, wonderful session, and thank you for sharing it. And I really look forward to your historical book collection coming together as well.
Thank you. Yes, hopefully 2021, as I said, worst case scenario, 2022. But thank you, everyone. And certainly if in this community, there are historically significant books by Indian women or other women from South Asia, I would welcome knowing about them. Because, you know, certainly we know Kataki Sheth and we know others more recently, but the history of the 20s or the 30s is a period that is quite vacant at this moment for us. So please share.
I've shared your email ID, so hopefully everyone will be writing to you with some photographer they know of. You know.
And I try to respond. I don't always do it promptly, but I do try. So.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Russet, and thank you everyone else for joining us today. And just before we leave on Wednesday, which is day after, we're going to have a chat with Daniel Bodke from Australia. And we'll be talking about his library setup and how he works around it. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening and have a lovely day for those of you joining us from the States. And to you, Russet.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening as well. I appreciated the opportunity. Bye.
Okay, take care.
Bye.